Okay, our second speaker this afternoon is Mr. Martin James. And Martin, when he's not hiking Hadrian's Wall or trekking through Iceland or searching for a unique aircraft museum, he's actually the Air Force historian. And it's a role that he's been in for, I think, 13 years now. And I had a look back and I found a quote from Martin. This is some time ago, I won't actually say when, but it was, I probably worked on every type of aircraft the Air Force was operating, beginning with the Canberra bomber. So most of these may be museum pieces now, but Martin certainly isn't. And he's actually very well placed to speak on the RAAF and the nuclear option. Thank you, Martin.
Probably best preface what I'm about to say is some days I really do feel like I should be in a museum, but there you go. And my daughters like to remind me of that fact on a regular basis. I'll open with an amusing story. Some years ago, while I was still in uniform, I was arriving on base with a few other fellow engineers, and we were there to do an airworthiness audit. And we had a young engineer with us, a new graduate from ADFA, and as we're going through the front gate of the base, he looked across and there was a Canberra. It was the one that did the Australian-England air race, and he said, "I don't believe there are still old farts of the Air Force that used to work on those aeroplanes." And I had to remind him at that point, yep, and I was part of the crew that did the last sea servicing on it before it went out of service. So yes, I feel my age. Okay, so the nuclear option. In preparing for this presentation, it initially was for me going to be a fairly simple narrative of Air Force thought it could use nuclear weapons at one point. It looked into it, it decided it possibly wasn't going to be that viable, and then the government decided it didn't want to go the nuclear option anyway. That's it. So I'm done. But when I started looking at it, and I'd be the first to admit I may have started looking at it from the perspective I desperately need to pad this presentation out a little bit. But one of the things that struck me is that it's a fundamental of warfare that when we get involved in conflict, there is a spectrum of conflict that we need to be anticipating that we're going to get engaged in sooner or later. No matter what technology does, no matter what strategy would suggest, one thing is quite realistic, and that is the nature of the types of conflicts we're going to get involved in is only going to get greater, not smaller. Our tasking, the actual when the bullets start flying, none of that changes. You know, we still anticipate we're going to get involved in hand-to-hand combat, all the way through that we anticipate that we could find ourselves fighting a cyber war. It never gets smaller, it only gets bigger. And of course, the implication then for all militaries is that in order to prepare for potential conflict, it has to prepare across the full spectrum of conflict. And it can't give up some capabilities in favour of new capabilities, the new shiny bright toys, for example, because let's face it, our adversaries are going to look at us in the perspective of how best to take our military capabilities down, and that would suggest an asymmetric approach against us. So we have to be prepared across a full spectrum. And the 21st century is no different. So when I started looking at this presentation, I started to think more in terms of what was the nuclear option for? Why was it so necessary for Air Force to take that step, for the government to think in those terms? And I started seeing a few more elements of the story started to come out. So without any further ado, let's get into it a little bit. Hang on. Okay, it's all about hitting the right button twice. Okay, so with that little bit of field training done, we'll keep going. So yes, I wanted to start looking at this at a slightly broader perspective. And the Cold War, and of course the period I'm looking at is predominantly 1950s into the 1960s, and the theme of this conference is in fact, the Cold War. But what we're getting involved in during this period of time cannot just be looked at through the lens of the Cold War. Sure, there's the proxy wars, and there's a number of conflict zones, but some of those conflicts we were getting involved in, or could have been involved in, are coming about not necessarily because of the Cold War, but it's because of nationalism and decolonisation, post-European and Japanese occupations. Malaysia, Indonesia, India, we could start listing any number of countries in the post-war Second World War period are regaining their independence, and that's generating a certain amount of conflict. And within some of those countries, there's also conflict. The Malay emergency was a really good example of a country moving towards independence, but it's having internal political difficulties that is getting complicated by what is essentially an insurgency, and we go to support Malaysia on that basis. Then of course we have the nascent United Nations generating requirements as well. Generally accepted, the first peacekeeping activity of the United Nations, Australia was part of. In fact, it led into Indonesia in 1947. These are roles that are coming out, and of course we're starting to see an emerging humanitarian and disaster relief requirement on the international basis, and you could popularly point to the Berlin airlift around those sort of commitments. But it is true to say that every conflict at the period was influenced, overshadowed, or complicated by the Cold War. So I've mentioned the spectrum of conflict a couple of times now, and this is lifted from the Air Force's Air Power Manual, a very contemporary-looking diagram, and I would be the first to admit that the language that's being used here is very contemporary. But this construct of a spectrum of conflict really has evolved from the lessons learned since 1945 and the nature of conflicts in which we can be involved. So the Air Force, as any modern military organisation, needs to consider where and how it is going to be engaged in these sorts of activities and taskings. And just as a bit of an example of this spectrum in real terms that the Air Force got involved in from 1947 to 58, if you look at the Dutch East Indies decolonisation and independence of Indonesia 1947 UN mission, Berlin airlift 48-49, Korean unification, and we have an observer capability on the ground as part of the UN mission from 1949 plus. The Korean War itself, when we put in close air support, interdiction, combat air patrols, aeromedical evacuation, and any number of airlift operations. Less well known is our NATO deployment to Malta in 1952-54, where we have a wing light of Vampire aircraft in support of NATO in that area of the world, and the Malay emergency itself. And this is all while we're maintaining our commitments to national defence and humanitarian aid, etc. And a simple example of that is whilst we had deployed forces with predominantly from 38 Squadron providing the Dakota operations in the Berlin airlift, we were conducting a not dissimilar sort of airlift here in Australia when large areas of northern Australia became isolated due to major flooding. So we had both a domestic and an international airlift, humanitarian airlift going on during that period of time. So very diverse. And I suppose just what I'm saying here, I'm trying to reinforce the fact here that we are, as an organisation, expected by government, expected by the Australian community to be able to perform operations across that broad spectrum. So what did the Air Force of the 1950s look like? Well, it was a bit of a hodgepodge. We have any number of World War II legacy platforms still on strength. The Mustang Fighter, the Dakota, C-47s, the Wirraway Trainer. There are numerous platforms on strength left over from the war that was still operating. Some of our deployable radars, for example, are also relics, but upgraded from the Second World War. We have our first generation fighters in the form of the Vampire and the Meteor, and as pretty as those aeroplanes are, they are still at the end of the day legacy platforms or legacy designs of the Second World War. And we also have our second generation fighters and bombers coming on stream in the 1950s in the form of the CAC Avon Sabre, potentially the best version of the F-86 Sabre to go into production, but some would argue otherwise, and the Canberra bomber, the Australian version of the Canberra bomber. We also have some very new stuff arriving in the form of an ASW and airlift capabilities typified by the Neptune and the Hercules aircraft. And I would freely admit, and there's an interesting point emerging with the Neptune aircraft, it is a World War II designed aeroplane. Simple as that. What marks it as different though, it's not the platform, it's the systems on the platform that make it a cutting edge anti-submarine warfare aircraft of the era. And we see that increasingly in our platforms to this day as we endeavour to address new and emerging taskings that we might be expected to perform. The F-111 that retired in 2010 was very, very different from the F-111 that we first acquired in country, at least in 1971. The systems on board that aeroplane that arrived in the 1970s was little better than a dumb bomber. By the time it retired, it was capable of precision strike and able to survive in an intense EW environment. Not as good as some of the other aircraft of the time, but certainly it was a different aircraft, and it was all related to systems improvement, not platform improvement. And we see that's a not uncommon element in today's aviation service. Of course, we start operating the Hercules, a game changer. We now have a truly global airlift capability. We're supporting British nuclear testing in Australia, and I would stress that support is more in the form of peripheral support rather than at the coalface of nuclear weapons development. But it gives a number of Air Force folks a little bit more visibility and appreciation of nuclear weapons. Interesting enough, we're also diversifying our workforce in this period of time. And when the Air Force was first starting to consider the reformation of its wartime women's service, it was doing so because of a people power shortage, or a manpower shortage as they referred to it at the time. And they first started discussing the inability of Australian youth to want, the unwillingness of Australian youth to want to join the Air Force back in 1947. And whilst the specific language they used didn't mention anything about being diverse, equality, etc., the phrasing nevertheless wouldn't be astray from the same sort of discussion now about a company trying to diversify its workforce more. It was very good, and in fact I would argue at that time the Air Force put up one of the first equal wage cases as part of its submission to Cabinet for the formation of a women's service in Australia, and it was Treasury that knocked it back, not the Air Force. Otherwise, we would have been paying our women the same in the 1950s when the force was formed, rather than having to wait until the late 1970s, early 80s, I think it was, before they achieved pay parity. But we're also starting to diversify our thinking, and this is important to discussion about our pursuing the nuclear options. And it's through things like the formation of the Air Force College, or the RAAF College, that starts to underwrite that ability. That we're starting to generate officers attuned to thinking about next generation opportunities. what was our strike capability like? And I've already touched on this a little bit. We're operating predominantly, our predominant strike force was the Abro Lincoln, and it cannot be described in any other way, but it's a World War II system. It's a Lancaster on steroids. That's the best way to describe it. Something a little bit more modern, of course, was the English Electric Canberra. Yes, its design may have started in the Second World War, but what we're looking at there is an aircraft with second generation jets on board, and in RAAF service at least, a more advanced bombing system than what was evident in the Second World War. And the fact that Australia wasn't operating an advanced bombing system in that aircraft, again, highlights for me the sort of improvement that the Air Force had to go through in its thinking and understanding of what it was buying. You talk to some people here in Australia and they would suggest that the British ripped us off when we bought the Canberra, that they were to supply it with a night bombing capability. However, when you actually look at what we specified and what we got was pretty much correct. We were a dumb customer, for want of a better description. So we didn't quite get the aeroplane we thought we were going to get, but then again, we didn't ask for the aeroplane that we wanted. So again, lessons learned. So let's get to the chase a little bit. The challenge that we have, and of course, as I've mentioned any number of times already, how does the Air Force of the 1950s sustain an affordable strike capability suitable for employment across the spectrum of conflict? Let's look at that problem a little bit more. Okay, here we go. All right. So the Canberra bomber. It's Australia's sole modern bomber, and it's our primary strike platform. Simple. It's max bomb load, and this is very dependent on configurations that are available. But we're looking at around 4,500 kilograms. Not particularly significant when you consider things like the Lancaster was delivering, far in excess of that in the Second World War. So we're not looking at a big bomb load here. There's only 48 aircraft theoretically available for operations. In reality, you'd be lucky to get more than 40 online at any one time due to training commitments, development commitments, and maintenance commitments. The mean bomb error is from anticipated altitude of about 1,300 metres is 250 metres with a 1,000 pound bomb or 500 kilo bomb. So what that means in essence, and even from the low level mean error of 50 metres dropped from a 900 metre altitude, is that in essence, what you're saying here is around half of your bombs are going to anticipate to be falling outside of their blast radius where you could expect to generate the effects that you want. And even at 50 metres, I would suggest a bomb of the typical 1,000 pound bomb of the period, you are only going to kill a soft target. You're not going to damage a hardened target of any variety. You're not going to do much damage to a tank. It will barely notice you there. So over half the bomb load of an already modest bomb load of a very modest fleet of aircraft isn't going to be doing you any good. So what that means for us is that our primary strike platform capability has no strategic weight and has very limited tactical effect. That's the reality we're looking at in the 1950s. So, and we know, the Air Force had a very good appreciation of what these limitations were in the 1950s. Already they were looking at the effectiveness of the RAAF Lincolns in the Malay emergency, and it's being employed in a counterinsurgency-like conflict, and it's anticipated this could well become the norm for us. consideration of material that was coming out of the UK and the US, and our own internal analysis was showing that in a high-end war that could evolve if the Cold War goes hot, is that our Canberra force could only be effective strategically if it was part of a much larger UK or US force. And even at the tactical level, it would have limited viability, due mainly to the fact that certainly by the second half of the 1950s, it's appreciated that the Sabre isn't going to be able to escort the Canberra anywhere, that the air-ground threat is getting rather complex, and the Canberra doesn't have any systems on board which will enable it to survive in a hostile environment. So, what's the solution? Well, rearm with atomic bombs. If you don't have lots, drop something bigger, I suppose. So what we were starting to look at was a minimum yield nuclear device capable of being carried by a Canberra, and it was already well understood and appreciated that the UK were able to or impart their nuclear strike force consisting of Canberras with nuclear weapons. Obviously they're not part of the V force, but they are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. And if a suitable nuclear weapon could be identified, it was thought that they could be used on RAAF Sabres and used, and I have seen the term close air support. I don't think that was intended. They meant what it said, but certainly near the battle space for interdiction and those sorts of things. I provide just by way of scale an example of the Mark 7 Thor missile. It was also used by the UK. I just want to stress that it's just for illustrative purposes. It was never identified as a weapon for the RAAF to buy, but more on that later. So we see that we start to develop a concept of operations on how we would employ a nuclear capability, and as part of that, they looked at, well, how would our allies feel about that, and found that it would fit in well within the extent CETO concepts of operations, which had already identified that if available, suitable tactical nuclear weapons could be used if CETO units or our allies are potentially going to be overrun. So who's influencing some of this thinking in Australia? We've already heard that Professor Ernest Titterton, the Foundation Chair of the Nuclear Physics at ANU, he was in Australia influencing events, and in 1953 he put a brief up to government. He provided both in person and written copies of these briefs. But the specific one, he spoke about the employment of tactical nuclear weapons in an Australian context. And he indicated that the targets were things like enemy beachheads, fleet concentrations and rebase areas. So this is direct threat to Australia, and the Soviet Union was identified as probably the only such threat, as unlikely as it might be, to Australian sovereignty. Now, based on his experience in analysing the Bikini Atoll testing, Titterton stressed that to be truly effective, these weapons needed to be focused on concentrated fleet units. Any dispersal, etc., he felt that we would probably be wasting our time. Not wasting our time, but they wouldn't be as effective as they might otherwise be. So target while the threat's still concentrated. And he felt that 12 small tactical nuclear weapons would be sufficient for Australia's use. The other influence is Brodie, Bernard Brodie. He was the lead author and editor of The Absolute Weapon, the 1946 analysis of the threat and impact of atomic weapons on US defence and defence policy. Now, I have seen a an executive summary of the absolute weapon was in fact provided to Shedden in 1953, and it's on the same file as a copy of Titherton's brief, 1953 brief on the employment. And there were several other papers in that same file, all showing how viable nuclear capability would be for Australia. So, you know, we're starting to see a little bit more traction and I suppose some intellectual weight influencing thought around this. There was one quote from Brodie which that struck me as relevant to the discussions here today, and that is that Brodie did not see nuclear weapons as replacing traditional forces, but supplementing them, and that they would be a synergistic relationship between the two forms of capability. As much as you know, that a traditional force will deflect, will provide limitations to adversary targeting and weapon delivery systems. Of course, what he doesn't mention, but it's still relevant for us, is that nuclear capability does not give us options to do humanitarian aid. It doesn't give us options on a counterinsurgency, etc. So again, coming back to that spectrum, Brodie doesn't acknowledge that, but still what he says, he's thinking in terms that traditional forces still have relevance in a nuclear force. So don't give up your weapon system, traditional weapon systems, traditional capabilities in favour of nuclear weapons. Rather, they supplement each other. Closer to home for Air Force, one of the influences is Air Marshal Sir Donald Hardman of the RAAF. He was one of the imports from the UK that came out and led the Air Force over the term of its life. Noted probably more for restructuring the Air Force in the 1950s into functional commands, which to some degree is still with us to this day. But he also less known for institutionalising RAAF air power doctrine into RAAF thinking. He came out to Australia in 1952, and in his luggage was the 1950 edition of the AP 1300 operations manual for the RAF, and that becomes that sort of thinking becomes institutionalised into Air Force to the degree that after Hardman leaves. And the new AP, or the fourth edition of the AP 1300 is released in the RAF formally adopts it as its air power doctrine. And it hangs on to that at least administratively until August 1990, that 1957 air power manual. It's obviously, it's more referred to than read, but I would note that right up until the late 1980s, junior Air Force officers looking to take that step up to squadron leader were still being examined on the principles of air power based on that 1957 manual. So Hardman's thinking is very influential in the Air Force at the time. Famously said that an Air Force without bombers is not an Air Force. And he certainly arrived thinking that strike is a primary function of the Air Force, and the version of the operations manual that we adopted in 1957, in fact it's in the introduction, it's like on the very first page, that central to RAF doctrinal thinking is nuclear strike. And it gets further airings throughout the book. Now that's not to say it is exclusively about nuclear strike. It in fact provides a very, very balanced assessment around the roles and functions of an Air Force, and it does highlight what traditionally called the roles of air power around close air support, control of the air, any submarine warfare, any surface warfare. All those sorts of things are still acknowledged and detailed. But like I said, it does have an influence on nuclear capability. So, where does all this go? Well, as it turns out, not very far. So, just by way of the timeline. Hang on, I've jumped ahead. Here we go. Okay, so 1956, Minister for Air Towney initiates a nuclear discussion around nuclear weapons or the acquisition of nuclear weapons for the Air Force. Sherger, who's the Chief of the Air Staff at that point, is involved. McBride, Defence Minister, and the Defence Committee are all consulted. There's discussions, and the Prime Minister's briefed in, and there's a general agreement that yes, we should make approaches to our allies around the feasibility of us becoming nuclear armed and giving us a strike capability of significant weight. Coincidentally, I've not found any evidence to suggest otherwise, other than coincidence. Whilst those discussions are taking place in confidence within Australian circles, the US releases a policy announcement, and you could just get the sense of a faceplant moment for Sherger, because just as they say, yeah, let's go out and look for nuclear weapons, the US announces that whilst they are quite happy to sell nuclear-capable weapon systems, aircraft and related systems, they would retain control of the nuclear weapons. Depending on, I suppose, the nature of the ally, just what that control of those weapons would actually mean. But certainly it would suggest that Australia was not going to acquire a US weapon that they could choose to use when and how they would like. So, March 57, as I've already said, we adopt the RAAF air power doctrine, which includes nuclear strike as part of the suite of air power roles. And in September 57, Sherger formally writes to Chief of Air Staff of the RAAF, seeking options that the RAAF might be able to exercise. And again, just one of those moments you think, it's like, is the world lining up against us here? In the same month that Sherger goes out looking for nuclear weapons, Menzies makes a public announcement that Australia would not become nuclear armed in the short term. And I would stress, in the short term. Whilst Menzies said that we were not about to go nuclear armed, he left the door open for that to be changed into the future, and he was quite clear about that. So it's almost like don't open your Christmas present too early, Sherger, because it may not happen. September 58, Sherger travels to the UK, and amongst other things he does while he's there is he reviews the UK nuclear weapon capability. One of the things he finds is that there's simply, in terms of the UK inventory, nothing suitable, and more importantly, nothing affordable, suitable for the RAAF. And one thing I've left off of that, though, is available. In fact, the tall Mark 7s in UK service would have been suitable for Australia. It would have been on the very edge of affordability, and had there been a more direct threat to Australia, it would have been affordable. But it wasn't available. It was supplied to the UK under a US-UK agreement, and the US simply would have said, no, you can't have that, Australia. UK, you can't supply it to them because these are our weapons, and we control who gets them and how they employ them. So there are some options there that certainly would have been suitable for Australia. And in 1958, Sherger then discusses some of these issues with the Chief of Staff of the USAF, who's very sympathetic around our requirements, and they identify some broad category of weapons that would have been suitable and affordable for Australia, but the question of the US policy that seems insurmountable. And this is where we start seeing this movement away from our commitment to becoming nuclear armed. From the period 59 to 61, a number of papers from within Air Force and in the broader community would suggest that not only community attitudes towards nuclear weapons becoming a little bit more negative, and certainly the government is sensitive to this public opinion, but with the maturation of ANZUS and Commonwealth defence relationships, etc., there's less need for Australia to be nuclear armed. June 61, it's formally agreed that there is now no immediate need, and there would be no further action to try and acquire anything. And we see this reflected in the acquisition process of the F-111. we don't pursue a nuclear capability with the aircraft. And now some people would suggest, oh, hang on, but there was elements of a nuclear weapons capability in the F-111s that we got. Yes, there was, and that was simply because we were too cheap to modify the thing out of it. But I would also stress, though, that residual nuclear capability in the Australian F-111s, I wouldn't even describe it as fitted for but not with. It was just so residual. And the systems that were, to make it a fully nuclear capable aircraft, that arrived in Australia in 1971, we would have to have removed some of the other systems out of the aircraft that we really, really wanted. And it would have made it more difficult then to upgrade it to its PAVTAC capability later, and the Harpoon, which was a unique Australian F-111 capability. So, look, I'll just leave it there. And more to the point, all those concerns around the Canberra suitability in the tactical sense, we see it during its employment, initially as it's operating, exercising with CETO forces in Malaysia, then later in Vietnam. They start to demonstrate a precision strike capability with Dun bombs, certainly in Vietnam. And they're walking 750-pound bombs along canals with pinpoint accuracy, well within a 100-metre distance from troops in contact. Now, having said that, two things that qualify that remark. One, to do it, they needed to work very closely every sortie from the point of weapons preparation all the way through to crew debriefs, and constant readjustment of the bomb sites and constant work on the aircrew ability to conduct its bombing runs to get that degree of accuracy. And of course what that means is that an early career Canberra crew are not going to be employed on strikes that require that degree of precision. It took an awful lot of professional and technical mastery to achieve that level of precision. And I would argue that the effort it took per sortie to do it would have exceeded the ability to sustain that in high tempo operations in a high intensity war. So it really, by the end of the 60s, the whole discussion around do we go nuclear, do we not, it's come off the table. And while I don't think the door is closed permanently, you've only got to listen to more recent discussions around the possibility of a nuclear-powered submarine and concerns around nuclear proliferation would suggest that, at least in the foreseeable future, it's not going to come back onto the table anytime soon. Thank you.
And we have time for a couple of quick questions. We can throw it open to the room.
Your earlier slide mentioned the deployment to Malta of the vampires. I've always had this question in my mind, how could that be considered to be non-warlike service, given that the RAAF group that they were a part of just was doing peacetime service?
Okay. It was never considered warlike service, and it comes down to how the Australian Honours and Awards system defines warlike service. And it's not about the effects that you're generating, it's about the threat the individuals face in the conduct of that service. And it was seen a relatively low threat rather than a significant threat to the individuals who were concerned. Now, that can get complicated at times, and we mentioned, Ross mentioned Ubon. Really complex. When the guys first hit the ground, it was considered warlike service. As the environment stabilised, it was considered non-warlike service. When certain threats emerged, it was retrospectively, a period was retrospectively considered warlike service. And then non-warlike service again. And the same thing happened during Okra and the airstrikes into northern Syria and Iraq. The guys that were dropping warlike service, the guys that were preparing the jets and loading the weapons, non-warlike service. And don't get me started on the grey area between the guys that were doing the tanking, the air-to-air tanking, whether it was warlike service or not. In the end, they just said the sensible thing, if you flew air-to-air, tanking. It was warlike. If you never got over the Gulf and never got past the Gulf and went over northern Iraq, doesn't matter. That's not complicated. But yeah, sorry if that answers your question.
All right, cool. Can you please join me in thanking Martin?